Hello, hello, everyone. As attendants are starting to trickle in, we will give you some time to do so, and then we will get started at the top of the hour. Yes, your mics will be automatically muted and will stay that way for the duration of the presentation. You will have the chat to put comments and thoughts along the way. There will be poll questions that come up, and you can put any questions you have as well in the Q&A section that's on your little dashboard there. And yes, this session is being recorded. Hello, hello, hello. Good day to everyone, and thank you for joining us at today's Client Enrichment Series presentation on Pricing Basics, Introduction to Occupancy Agreements. My name is Victor Mendez, and I am a member of GSA's Client Enrichment Series team, serving out of the Eagleton Courthouse in St. Louis, Missouri. I'll be serving as your host for today's installment of the Client Enrichment Series. Now, before we begin, I want to let everyone here know that we are recording today's session, as you may see at the top of the screen. We post our archived Client Enrichment Series videos on our YouTube channel, where you can where you can access our past sessions at any time, day or night. There is a link to our YouTube channel at the end of today's slide deck. Today's presentation will be led by Kelly Ellison. Will be led by Kelly Ellison, a space pricing specialist for the Pricing Policy and Tools Division in our Office of Portfolio Management and Customer Engagement. Kelly is a member of a 3-person team responsible for reviewing, updating, and maintaining operating practices for rental policy. Kelly has been with GSA for 16 years and began her career in the Career Development Intern Program. She returned to portfolio after 2 years of rotation. Prior to GSA, Kelly spent 7 years at a nonprofit lobbying firm. Kelly holds a master's in business administration and a bachelor's of arts degree, both from the University of Maryland, College Park. Kelly will also be assisted by Trina Hughes, her colleague from the Central Office Pricing Team, for Q&A during today's presentation via the Q&A feature on your dashboard. Trina has been with GSA for 21 years, and she started as a contract employee in leasing, was hired by GSA as an employee and LCO in GSA's Region 8. Trina moved to the National Pricing Office and has been there for the last 11 years. Now, for today, we are spending 90 minutes on an introduction to occupancy agreements. The objectives for today's covered material are as follows. We will be learning what an occupancy agreement is, the types that exist, and the parts of an occupancy agreement. We host these client enrichment series presentations each month and cover a wide range of topics. Each presentation is led by an expert on the subject and can provide anywhere from a basic overview of a topic to a more advanced deep dive into the nitty-gritty. Before I turn the presentation over to Kelly, I'd like to share a few housekeeping instructions. Once again, please be aware that we are recording this session and that we post archived client enrichment series seminars. Can everyone hear me? Is anyone else having issues in the chat?
Victor, I can hear you loud and clear.
All right, just making sure. Thank you all so much for letting me know. No issues, you can hear you, perfect. All right, well, in that case, it might just be a matter of checking your volume or your speakers. Now, as I was saying, we post our archived client enrichment series seminars on our YouTube channel, the link of which is on the last page of your slide deck. And speaking of the slide deck, if you did not receive an email with a PDF of today's presentation slide, let us know in the chat, and one of our CES team members will send it to you right away. We have automatically muted your audio to help control the sound quality of the presentation. If you experience any audio issues during today's presentation, first check the audio level on your phone or computer speakers. And if you hear a crackling or static in the background, you can try hanging up to disconnect your audio and then reconnecting. If you have any questions during this presentation, please use the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen, not the chat. You can type your questions or comments in the box, and one of our and your fellow attendees or a member of our team will be able to answer your question. We hope to encourage an interactive dialogue using this feature. We'll try to address all questions during the session today, either in the Q&A or as part of the presentation. And afterward, these questions will also be put into a frequently asked questions document, which will be shared with you. Any questions that we are unable to answer today, as I just said, will be answered and posted to gsa.gov/CES website. If you prefer to suppress the chat feature, you can click on a, sorry about that. You don't have to open the chat if you do not wish to. Thank you. And now I will turn it over to Kelly to begin our presentation. Kelly, you have the floor.
Thank you, Victor. Again, my name is Kelly Ellison, and my colleague Trina Hughes will be assisting me with the Q&A at the end of the presentation. As Victor mentioned, please remember that chat is for technical questions and the Q&A pod is for questions relating to the PowerPoint. Trina will do her best to answer those questions as I proceed with the presentation. And if we have time at the end, I will try to answer some of those questions live. Now, whether you have heard this presentation before or you are new to pricing, we have a lot of good information today. And so I hope that you find it useful. So sticking on this agenda slide, we're going to go over a few useful terms. And then we're going to talk about what is an OA. The majority of the presentation will deal with the types of OAs and the description of what an OA actually entails. It's broken down into 4 parts: description of space and services, clauses, the signature section, and the financial section. At the end, I have a few slides. They're going to talk about some additional resources. Next slide. Now, before I go into these useful terms, I also just want to mention at the bottom right hand of your screen in blue bold, you will see on some slides a reference to the pricing desk guide section. If you want more information or more details about something that I talk about on the slide, we have included this reference for you. So before we get started, just some basic background on 5 key terms. The first being, what is federal space? That is space that is held in our GSA inventory, and that is space we rent to you, the tenant agency. The rent here is based on an appraisal or return on investment, also called ROI, with other applicable charges added. In our lease space, that is space where GSA enters into a lease for space and we pay rent to the lessor. Rent is then passed through to the client agency, and it will include any operating cost not performed through the lease, as well as the PBS lease fee and any other applicable charges. Next slide. Now, obviously, this is occupancy agreement training, and we'll refer to it as OA. And what that is a concise statement of the business terms that govern our relationship with you. So all of this kind of falls under pricing policy, and that is detailed in our pricing desk guide, which I may refer to as PDG. It is the policies used by the Public Building Service, or PBS, and we use these to price real estate and related services to our federal customer agencies in both our owned and our leased portfolio. Rent is the amount that we charge to our customer agencies for that space and related services. Next slide. So this next graph may look familiar to some folks. This was presented in last month's training, but what I particularly wanted to bring your attention to is the first arrow under identification and the last bullet where you see client project agreement. Now, the space request life cycle can be a long process. At the beginning of the project, during the requirements gathering phase, PBS works with the tenant agency to determine its overall needs. This should begin somewhere between 18 and 36 months out. And the client project agreement, or CPA, is developed in conjunction with the occupancy agreement. So you should be seeing your OA at the start of this PBS project life cycle. Next slide. So again, the OA is a statement of business terms. It's a formal interagency agreement between the two signing parties, that being GSA and the tenant agency. It's meant to cover the financial specifics and responsibilities of both parties, and it keeps the customer informed of rent charges and project costs. The OA can also serve, and often does serve, as a budgeting tool, since it documents the current and future rent a tenant agency can expect to pay, and consequently, the current and future revenue that PBS can expect to collect. Next slide. Now, there are several different types of OAs. When we first draft an OA, the tenant agency signs that OA. And that is to signify that the tenant agency wants the space, is budgeting for the space, and intends to pay rent for the space. Throughout this process, that OA gets modified to reflect the most recent up-to-date terms. So these OAs are called pro forma OAs. In lease space, PBS conducts an acquisition to procure the space and negotiates the terms of the lease deal. The OA is updated with the location and specific terms and condition for the tenant agency signature. PBS cannot sign a lease until the tenant agency signs the OA, and then the lessor builds out the space with PBS oversight. Likewise, in owned space, PBS identifies the space and reviews what changes may be needed. The OA is updated with location and specific terms and conditions and is presented again to the tenant agency for signature. Then PBS acquires build-out services and oversees the space build-out within that building. As a small caveat, I want to stress that this process is what should be happening. We make every effort to train our associates in the proper way to disseminate information to the customer. We often get the question of, how many OAs am I supposed to get? We don't want to have you receiving 20 OAs and asking for a signature on each one when it's not required. But by the same token, we don't want to only hand you one OA during the entire length of the project. No two projects will be the same or require the same amount of pro forma OAs, since each project is different. Our intention is to add additional iterations as appropriate. And a signature if required, and that would be if financial terms or square footages increase. Now, you may notice that I talk extendedly on some slides, and that information is not on the slide. When we update and send out the final PowerPoint, we will have some additional notes in the notes section of the PowerPoint. Next slide, please. So when it's time to bill, a final OA is issued. The OA contains the exact terms and is what the agency will be billed from. On your slide, you will see that the final OA is issued after substantial completion, which we'll talk about later. But after substantial completion, PBS coordinates to move the agency into the new space. In lease space, an updated lease agreement, or LA, is done with the occupancy date. The final OA may not need to be signed again if the pro forma OA was signed for a sufficient amount early on. However, if it turns out that the shell rent or the tenant improvements or any other component of the signed pro forma OA was not equal to or greater than the actual final amount, we do have to get a new signature on that final OA. So in the meantime, while we are trying to get that signature from the tenant agency, you will have what is called an interim billing OA. Next slide. Now, the last type of OA that I want to mention is an administrative OA. This is when we send a OA to you only for informational purposes, and we do not require you to sign it. Some examples would include a joint use amenity that has been added or removed from the building, capital expenditures for new or enhanced security fixtures or features, and these would need to have been approved by the Facility Securities Committee, or FSC. If there is a lease extension where the extension is advancing only the lease expiration date and there are no changes in the rent or square footage, or if there are parking spaces and some are going to be added or removed from the assignment. Also, if there were antennas added or removed from the assignment, all of these would be examples of when the agency would receive an administrative OA. So just to recap, that was 4 types of OAs. The pro forma, which is your initial OA and what you get throughout the life cycle of the project. Your final OA, which is what you will be billed from. Your interim OA, which is what you use if we need to go back and get signatures for that final OA. And the administrative OA, which is for informational purposes only. So at this point, next slide, I'm going to hand it over to Rebecca, and she is going to do a knowledge check to make sure that everyone has been listening so far. Rebecca.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Kelly. Okay, let's see how we're all doing here several days post daylight savings. Why is an OA important? We've got 4 choices. It keeps the customer informed of rent charges and project costs. B, it helps PBS ensure that we don't incur financial obligations in excess of what the customer agency is willing to commit to. C, neither A nor B. Or D, both A and B above. And we're getting very good voter turnout. We're just over 50% here. I'll give it another 10 seconds. Oh, and thank you for you voting in the chat. I forgot, if you can't see Zoom completely, I'm apologizing that you can't see the slide or the poll question, but you can see the slide. Okay, Kelly, with 58% of the vote in, I'm going to end the polling and share it.
Wonderful. It looks like folks are listening. If you could hit enter, please, and we will highlight that the answer is D, both A and B above. So Victor, if you could hit enter, there we go. Both A and B. So an OA is important because it does both. It makes sure that both PBS and the tenant agency are on the same page about the financial terms, and it keeps the customer aware of incurring rent charges. Next slide, please. So now we're going to go on to the 4 parts of the OA. We have the description of space and services, the clauses, terms and conditions, the signature page, and the financial summary. I will be spending a significantly more amount of time on the clause section, but for now, let's hit enter or next slide, and we can talk about the description of space and services. One more time, please. As the name suggests, this section of the OA is at the start of your OA, and it basically tells you how much square footage you're going to have, the number of parking spaces, if any, the type of space you have, the building name and address, and the OA term. All the general information you need to know about your space. Important to note is that the OA gives you, the tenant agency, a right to occupy the space for a specific duration. Tenant agencies do not have a perpetual right to occupy the space identified in the OA term. And that is why you will see, for instance, in this example, the second to last line where it says Phoenix, Arizona for a period of 106 months. And that starts on, in this example, February 16th, 2011. Next slide. So that was pretty simple. Now we are going to get into clauses, terms, and conditions. Before I start talking about them, I want to tell everyone that we have heard from our tenant agencies that the OA seems to be getting longer and longer. And so now we are taking a look at how we can streamline our OAs so they are more in line for each specific space location, instead of regurgitating everything from the pricing desk guide onto the OA. The goal is a more streamlined, shortened OA for each space assignment. So to that end, while the policy behind the clauses I will discuss today remains in effect, some of the clauses may have different wording, look different, or may be replaced completely by a reference to the pricing desk guide once the OA clause review process has been completed. We hope to have a new look for the OAs that we can show customers by the end of the summer. So there are basically 4 types of clauses. We will spend our time talking about mandatory clauses, but I still wanted to briefly mention the other types of clauses. So first, we do have the standard or mandatory clauses. They are going to be slightly different based on whether you're in leased or federal space, but you will find this as standard clauses on your occupancy agreement. The next type of clause is agency-specific clause. Now, this could be for all of the OAs for a tenant agency or a specific subset, maybe by a specific location. The next type of clause are optional clauses, and these are usually situational based. The last type of clause is an ad hoc clause, and this is really customized, specific to an assignment, and not included anywhere else in the OA. I wanted to point out that we do not accept any pen and ink changes to the OA, and that is either from GSA side nor the tenant agency side. And now let's get into those actual clauses. Next slide, please. If you could hit enter one time for me, please. I think, there we go. So this clause talks about your rent start date. And as I mentioned a few slides back, these clauses will likely look very different in the upcoming months, but I have included the specific wording from these clauses in this presentation for reference. I won't read them verbatim, but I will be summarizing them as we go along. If you could hit enter one more time for me. So what these two clauses on the previous page and this page talk about is when your space becomes substantially complete and operationally functional, that your rent will start. Next slide. And what you will also see is that we have tried to highlight the major point of each clause with that yellow arrow. So next slide, please. So a tenant's obligation to pay rent in a space is basically governed by two things. That is when the space is substantially complete and when the space is operationally functional. Now, before a tenant moves in, they should be given the opportunity to participate in a walkthrough of the space. And that's also before there's final acceptance by PBS. In a lease, the space qualifies as substantially complete with the granting of an occupancy permit and our acceptance of the space that has to be in accordance with the lease. And lastly, when the government has access to the premises and occupancy, possession, use, and enjoyment thereof. In our federal space, the space is substantially complete when, again, PBS accepts the space in accordance with the general construction contract, and when the government, again, has access to the premises and occupancy, possession, use, and enjoyment thereof. Now, when we talk about operationally functional, that means that all the building systems must function and the building specific safety and security features must be operational. So for example, if you have an HVAC system that is not working, the space could not be considered operationally functional. Now we do allow occupancy and rent start in phases, and those dates should be coordinated with the tenant. However, we do not give grace periods for moves or installation of personal property. On the previous slide, that yellow arrow was highlighting this fact. So for example, if an agency has issues with their furniture procurement and it's not going to be ready in time for their rent start date, GSA will not postpone the rent start date for this reason. Next slide. Now, we briefly touched on this when we went over the vocabulary words at the beginning of the presentation. Lease space is the rent is a pass-through of the underlying lease contract rent plus any standard operating cost not performed through the lease and the PBS lease fee. Where in owned space, rent is based on an appraisal or return on investment, also called ROI. Now, the legislative foundation behind how we charge rent for space is from the Federal Property and Administrative Services Act of 1949. It basically authorizes GSA administrator to direct and charge government agencies for furnished spaces and services at rates that are approximate to the commercial charge for comparable space and services. So Congress gives you the agency appropriations to pay rent, and in turn, you pay GSA rent for the space that you require in order to accomplish your agency missions. Next slide. Now, this clause talks specifically to the lease contract rent. Now, it is PBS's practice to procure fully serviced leases. The rent charged to the tenant agency is a pass-through of that underlying PBS lease contract. Both the operating costs and the real estate taxes that PBS pays to the lessor as part of the lease are passed through to the tenant agency. The lease rent will also include any standard operating costs not performed through the lease. It also includes the 7% fee. That fee covers contract risks, lease acquisition services, and lease administration. That fee is not reduced except for the case of non-cancelable space where it's 5% and United States Postal Service space where it's 4%. So other than those two instances, that fee will remain at 7%, regardless of whether the tenant agency decides to self-perform any services. Again, if you would like more information on that, I would refer you to the bottom right-hand corner where we have referenced the pricing desk guide. Next slide. This is the clause for rent in our federally owned space. The shell and base year operating rent, also known as the fully serviced rent, is based on a fair annual rent appraisal, which we call FAR appraisal, and it is for a 10-year period. Now, there are some benefits to having that 10-year rate. And if we can go to the next slide. The fair annual rent, or FAR, is the annual amount in rent that may reasonably be expected to be paid for the right to use real property. And this rate is established in the open market. Now, the benefit of the 10-year shell rate is that the customer will have a rate that is typically reflected by a lower rental rate. The 10-year rate provides consistency and budget predictability, and also aligns with the long-term tenancies in the commercial market. The 10-year rate also helps lower administrative costs for tenant agencies and GSA. So you get the benefits of a levelized 10-year rate, and as the customer, you can still continue to rely on your release of space rights. So having the 10-year rate does not take away the option for you to release space should your agency need to do so. Now, unless you know at the onset of a project that you will definitely not need a space for that 10-year period, having that 10-year rate really is a great benefit for the tenant agency. Next slide. The operating rent rates are developed through FAR appraisal, fair annual rent appraisals, rather than actual PBS cost. The use of appraisal-based FAR operating costs provides tenant agencies with industry benchmarked operating costs, and it insulates the agencies from the risk that PBS undertakes in operating the building. So, for example, if you have a particularly hot summer where the HVAC in the building has to be run longer or at a lower temperature to keep the temperature in the building cool, or if you have a particularly cold winter and the heat has to be run at a higher temperature or for longer than normal to maintain the temperature in the building, the tenant agency is insulated for those ups and lows in the bill for electricity. The appraisal-based operating rent covers the provision of building services and utilities that are typical for an operation of an office building. But if you have a unique situation, for instance, maybe you have a 24/7 operation where you do have to run your AC for 24/7, that would be considered an above standard cost, again, reimbursable by RWA. Next slide. One more note with the 10-year op rate, an exception to using industry benchmarks would be return on investment pricing or ROI pricing. In those situations, PBS may use actual operating expenses. Now on to our customer rights clause. The first paragraph essentially states that the pro forma OAs contain preliminary financial information. You also find the important reference to requiring a signature prior to PBS awarding any contract for design or construction award in federal space, or before awarding a lease and lease space. Now, the financial terms clause, if you hit enter one more time, details when an agency can release space. Now, these clauses are going to be slightly different for leased or owned. In this case, this is talking about a lease because it notes that you have to be in your space for 12 months before you can give your 4 months to vacate. It also says that if the space is returned, the unamortized balance must be repaid, and any free rent or other concessions must be repaid on a pro rata basis. Also, that last sentence states that you do not need to certify the current year funds that are available for future year obligations. And if you hit enter one more time, I believe it should highlight. Oh, it didn't. Well, it was the last sentence. Now on to cancellation rights. So when we talk about your cancellation rights, there are basically two situations: prior to and after contract execution. PBS provides the tenant agency with a no-fault cancellation up until we execute a lease, purchase a site, or award a design contract. What that means is if the tenant agency cancels the requirement for occupancy, PBS will make no claim against them for any PBS-borne costs that is related to the normal pursuit of occupancy. If the tenant agency withdraws from the project before PBS reaches a point of obligating the government to a contract. However, in a lease, if PBS happens to execute tenant agency requested services that are outside of the services that we would normally provide as part of our fee, and we do not get upfront reimbursement, we do reserve the right to pursue reimbursement with the tenant agency. And that is regardless of whether the customer agency canceled before contract execution or before occupancy. Ideally, this situation would be far and few in between, since we work closely with the tenant agency to determine the program of requirements. Now, for cancelable assignments only, if a tenant agency decides to cancel its plans for occupancy after PBS obligates the government to a contract, but before rent start, then the agency is liable for the lesser of two costs based on whether you are in federally owned or leased space. Now, looking at the chart, you can see in leased space, it would be the 16-month rental obligation had the customer occupancy occupied the space, plus the unamortized balance of the tenant improvements, or the lease buyout costs, whichever is less. In your federal space, it would be the 4-month rental obligation had the customer agency occupied the space, plus the unamortized balance of the tenant improvements, or the total project cost incurred, again, whichever is less. Next slide. So when we talk about return of space rights, there are certain conditions that must be met before you can provide that 4 months. First, obviously, there should no longer be a need for the space. The space must also be in marketable blocks. The space cannot be designated as a non-cancelable OA, which we'll talk about more. And if in a lease, the tenant agency is at least 16 months into their OA term. Now, when returning space, tenants are still obligated to pay the principal balance remaining on any tenant improvements. Tenant agencies should submit their written notice to PBS immediately upon their intent to release space. The rent charges will be removed only if PBS finds a backfill tenant, and only to the extent to which the backfill tenant agency's rent, not including TIs, cover the total rent obligation. However, I want to point out that this is a great benefit afforded to federal customers, which is not provided in the private sector. Now, when we talk about marketable blocks, we are referring to the location. So for instance, if you had a space that was only accessible by going through another tenant agency space, that would not be marketable. We talk about usage. For instance, you can't return a loading dock. And we talk about size of space. So for instance, you could not return a janitorial closet. Next slide. Now, when we talk about non-cancelable space, we are talking about space that is remote or not easily accessible. It has a special build out or special purpose. So to retrofit that area would really be cost prohibitive. All our lease constructions are non-cancelable. May have an unusual term. It may have a lack of any realistic federal need, or any other factors that significantly impair our ability to backfill. PBS reviews each space assignment and uses the above criteria to designate space as non-cancelable. PBS also reduces the 7% fee to 5% for lease assignments that are designated as non-cancelable. However, an agency cannot volunteer to have their non-cancelable space only because they want to have that reduced fee. That determination is made solely by PBS. The decision is made on the first pro forma OA and remains in effect for the duration of the OA term. And I actually misquoted something from my previous page when I talked about a tenant being able to return space and how the charges would only be removed if we found a backfill tenant. That reference was if a tenant agency was trying to return non-cancelable space. So in a situation where you have non-cancelable space and you want to return it, technically you could, but you would continue to pay rent, your operating cost, everything, until we found a suitable back tenant, if we found a suitable back tenant. So sorry for that clarification. Also, in terms of non-cancelable space, the most common are going to be your LPOEs or land ports of entry and airport leases. Next slide. This clause also talks about forced moves, and I will discuss that on a later slide. So next slide. This clause talks about tenant caused delays and PBS caused delays, which I'm also going to talk about. If we could hit enter twice. So again, this is the end of the clause, move schedule clause. And what's important here to note is that when you move into a space, GSA makes a plan. We have schedules that drive other activities, such as lease agreements and construction plans. All of these activities have cost consequences. So if a tenant causes a delay from the agreed schedule in a move out of its current location or into its new location, then PBS may charge that tenant agency rent at both locations. Now, a tenant agency caused delay could occur when changes in the scope of the project are made. If the tenant agency fails to make timely decisions on the finished schedule, or if the tenant agency failed to meet review schedule for DID drawings or design intent drawings. The reason we would charge rent in both places or in both spaces is because first, the tenant agency is the responsible party for the delay. The failure to access that double rent may remove the incentive for the tenant agency to abide by the schedule. Neither the contract fee nor conventional real estates paid to PBS are really designed to recoup costs associated with delays in these types of situations. And in lease space, lessors routinely accelerate rent in the case of a tenant delay to avoid incurring significant losses. So we are in line with market practices. Now, if PBS or a lessor is the cause of the delay, in the case of a lesser cause delay, If it's a landlord that creates the delay, no rent is payable for the period of the delay. If PBS causes the delay, in addition to no rent being payable for that period of the delay, PBS may also be responsible for costs for additional storage for furniture, reprocurement expenses, or possibly additional consulting fees. PBS reimburses a tenant agency for PBS increased cost by providing the tenant agency the equivalent value in free rent. There are also excusable delays. Unforeseen weather issues could be an example of something like that. Next slide. Agencies are responsible for funding their own physical moves and telecommunication costs at the beginning of an occupancy. If you think back to the first section of the OA, description of space and services, where I noted the OA term, that designates the amount of time that the agency has that space. When that time is up, if the agency is no longer staying in that space, they would be responsible for their physical move, again, and telecommunication costs. Now, of course, there are always exceptions. The two exceptions here would be a forced move or an emergency due to a disaster. Now, in the case of a forced move, even PBS can be considered the forcing agency. However, if PBS provides 3 years written notice for either a disposal or a prospectus project, then we would not be considered the forcing agency. And that is actually detailed in the move cost responsibility clause. If you are interested in learning more about what the forcing agency would be responsible for, some of those items include the cost of relocation for the agency that's being forced out, which includes the physical move, any increase in the displaced agency's overall rent. And if you would like more information on that, please see Pricing Desk Guide, Chapter 4. Next page. So at this point, it is time for another knowledge check to see if folks are still listening. So Rebecca, I will hand it back over to you.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. Let's see, number 2. Oh, this is sort of an after lunch easy one. True or false? An agency may request that their space be non-cancelable. True or false? And we're getting lots of participation. It's not much of a horse race. We've got a clear lead here. All right, we got 50% voting. Give it another 3 seconds or so. Okay, Kelly, with 52% voting, I will end it and share the results.
Great. So the majority of folks got that correct. The correct answer is false. An agency may not request that their space be non-cancelable simply to get that 5% reduced fee. PBS makes the determination for each space assignment based on backfill potential, but a large majority of our assignments do end up being cancelable. Now, we had another knowledge check question, I believe, which should be on, there we go.
Okay, here we go. With 4 months written notice, customer agencies have the right to release space when A, the space is in marketable blocks, B, the space is not designated in the OA as non-cancelable, C, the tenant is at least 16 months into their occupancy term in lease space, or D, all of the above. And again, this is multiple choice. Okay, and we've got 51% voted, so we'll end the polling. Look at that.
Boy, they are on point today. You know, when I was studying for SATs, which I don't even know if they still do, one of the tips for studying was if it's a multiple choice, chances are if you pick all of the above, then that's going to be correct. In this case, it was true. All these factors have to be in place in order for a customer to release space back. It has to be in marketable blocks, talking about location, usage, and size. It cannot be designated as non-cancelable. Although, as a caveat, if you remember, you can return non-cancelable space, but you continue to pay rent. And in lease space, the tenant agency has to be at least 16 months into their occupancy term. So great job, folks are listening. Next slide. So now we are on to the signature page of the OA and why getting that signature is so important. So we finished talking about, our most common standard clauses, and here what you have on your screen is a sample of what the signature page looks like. Again, please note the GSA representative should be signing the OA first before sending it to you, the tenant agency. Next slide. So the OA signature is required before we incur significant costs to pursue a new procurement or a new project. Now in a lease, that's going to be before submitting a lease prospectus project or before awarding a lease contract. In owned space, that is going to be before purchasing a site or awarding a design contract. The latest iteration of the tenant's signed OA confirms its commitment to the project and also its commitment to pay rent. So again, if the tenant agency later backs out of the signed OA, PBS does reserve the right to seek reimbursement. So both GSA and the tenant agency have some responsibilities in terms of the OA signature. GSA should present the OA and get it to you for signature so the project is not stalled or delayed. GSA should ensure that you understand why you're receiving the OA and why your signature is needed at that time. And GSA should present the OA directly to the appropriate agency contact. And again, we should have our signature on it before it gets to you. Now, the agency should provide a timely response, meaning review of the OA and signing the OA to help keep the project on track. And the agency should reach out to the realty specialist or regional client planning manager if the agency has questions which are going to prevent you from signing and returning the OA. Next slide. So we require a signature, again, before we purchase a site, before we obtain new space, and that's whether we're talking about an initial occupancy or a backfill occupancy, whenever an agency expands its space assignment, or if there are additional TI amortizations. Again, for specific details on signature requirements, I do encourage you to look in pricing desk guide for the sections referenced on this slide. Next slide. Now, there may be situations where a signature is required, and if GSA is not able to obtain a signature after repeatedly trying to get in contact with the customer, we may act without a signature to protect the government's financial interest. And the two that come to mind are if you had a forced move or if you had an occupancy after lease expiration. Also, for systematic annual rate updates, there would be no signature required, and no OA would be sent to the customer. So something like real estate taxes, antennas, or operating cost, in those instances, the agency does not get an OA at all. So obviously there's nothing to sign. Next page. Now, before we talk about the last section of the OA, that being financial terms, I wanted to talk a little bit about these two clauses. Here is the occupancy after lease extension and succeeding lease renewal clause. These two clauses apply to lease space and address when an agency fails to provide a signature, but GSA must continue to bill. When an agency continues to occupy space, but has failed to return an executed copy of the OA in a succeeding lease or a lease renewal, these clauses explain that we will continue charging the customer and that the new negotiated rates will be passed through to the customer. The intent of the clause is to help PBS continue to bill in a timely manner again, and to reduce spending taxpayer money and protect the government's financial interests. Now, that first clause is automatically included on an OA when a customer continues to occupy their space but fails to sign the OA. This clause does not remove the need for GSA to work with the customer to try to get the signed OA. We should be working with our customers on requirements development and space options well in advance of a lease expiration. As I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, 18 to 36 months out. And we should still be making a good faith effort to get signatures. That second clause is used in conjunction with the first, so that after we notify the customer that the lease is expiring and that we are going to bill, this clause tells the customer that it's actually happening. Now, in owned space, a continuing occupancy is when the tenant agency remains in the same space that it occupied during the prior OA term. If a continuing occupancy is initiated and there is no change to the usable square feet and there are no new tenant improvements added, then only an administrative OA would be sent to the customer. A signature is only required when there is new space, expanded space, or more amortizations of TIs. So that is why these clauses really only apply to lease space. Next slide. So why do we need your signature on the OA? It serves as the agreement to start billing. It is the agreement that outlines what should be expected from each party, that being GSA and the tenant agency. It documents the rent charges, and it is critical to help keep the project on schedule. And it also helps to ensure that we are meeting your agency requirements. Now, to reiterate, timely response and review of the OA by both GSA and the tenant agency is critical to keeping that project on schedule. We see a lot of non-responsive customers on some of these OA signatures, or really long delays in getting the OA back to us. So we really want you to understand why it's so important for you to review the OA and provide a signature or come back with questions in a timely fashion. The OA review and signature process really is a key communication tool that helps the project stay on track. Next page. Now this brings us to another, and I believe our last knowledge check. So Rebecca, I will hand it over to you.
Okay, polling question number 4. When must a customer sign an OA? We've got 4 options. A, for new space. B, for expansion space. C, to amortize TI in the rent. Or D, all of the above. Oh, look at all those smart people in the chat. I don't think we're fooling anybody with these options, Kelly.
Well, I did give them that hint for the last.
Yeah.
Maybe I should have kept my mouth shut.
All right, we'll give everybody just another moment or two. We got 54%. Gosh, if we could get these voter turnouts, this is great. Okay, 54%. Here we go. And sharing the results. There you go.
Awesome. It almost looked like almost everyone chose D, all of the above. So anytime there is a change to the amount of rent or the amount of space agencies has, the signature on the OA signifies agreement between the two parties, again, that being GSA and the tenant agency. So yes, all of the above, in all those instances, we need a signature on the OA. Next page. This brings us to our final section, the financial summary section. Next page. So the final summary section of the OA is a preview of what the tenant agency can expect to see on their rent bill. It itemizes the different cost components of the rent payment, and it also summarizes the financial terms as well as any lump sum payment requirements. So this really can serve as a planning and budgeting tool for the tenant agency. Next slide. So here's an example of what it looks like. You can see it breaks out the cost components. You have your shell rent, your operating cost, your joint use, BSAC, and if there were any lump sum payments, you have your reimbursable services on line H, as you can see. So very self-explanatory. Next page. So that is going to conclude the presentation regarding OAs. Before I close out, however, I do want to make everyone aware of some additional resources that are available to you. This page shows you where you can find the PDG, which is the basis for what I have been talking about today in those mandatory clauses. This is a great resource for customers who are seeking a more thorough understanding of PBS's pricing policy and its applications. You know, if you're up late one night and you are looking for some riveting reading, you could also download this and read a couple of chapters. Client Engagement also has a recorded training session on the Pricing Desk Guide 5th edition if you are interested in learning more about pricing policy in general. Next slide. The second website I want to bring to your attention is Rent on Web, or ROW. Some of you may be aware of this or already signed up for this application. Customers are able to directly access their rent bill, which can improve the efficiency and speed with which you receive your bills. Obviously, it's greener for the environment because we're not printing out copies, and it gives your agency the ability to download information to run your own analysis. So if you don't already have access to this page or application, I do encourage you to do so. Next slide. This application is called Electronic OA, or EOA, which again, some of you may already be aware of. EOA is a customer-facing application where real-time OA information is available to help support your decision-making process. The application lets you search OAs within designated agency bureau codes. It can run reports, as well as summarize financial information and preview your OA rate calculations. Next slide. Now, we also have the PBS customer dashboard. From here, you can access information like your final OAs and rent information, as well as information on specific agency projects. We also have a YouTube presentation for this topic that you can access at your leisure to find out more about the updates that were recently made. Next slide. Now, if you do have specific questions about your OA, or if you're having difficulty accessing any of the applications that I've mentioned today, please contact your regional client planning manager or your real estate specialist, who should be able to help you. So with that, I am going to pass it over to Trina. I do believe we have time for some questions from the crowd. or anyone from the client engagement team.
Well, we
Sorry,
do.
Kelly, I was on mute.
There you go.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
Okay. Trying to get to these, just bear with me.
Not a problem.
Okay. We have a question here for you, Kelly. Why do you have to be in space for 12 months in a lease before you can submit your 4-month notice to vacate?
Okay, that is a great, excuse me, that is a great question. If you just bear with me one moment, guys. My computer is glitching on me. I can't believe we got through the entire presentation. And this is when it decides it wants to go bonkers on me.
At least it was after completing the full presentation.
Yes. I was worried that some child was going to run through and be asking me questions, and that was going to show up on the recording, but okay.
If you have a problem, Kelly, I can try and help you with the answer, but I'll give you another few seconds here to see if you can solve your IT.
I think I'm good. You guys are breaking up a little bit. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Awesome. Okay, so I think the goal of the 16-month restriction in leases is really to incentivize our customers to develop valid requirements. We want to help avoid obligating taxpayer funds in leases where the tenant may not actually have a need. So keep in mind, lease buyout is not always possible, and it's usually very expensive. So in contrast, there's less risk in federally owned space because those properties are already in our inventory, and government assets and construction projects can be terminated for convenience when it's in the government's best interest. So generally, we just want to make sure that you really do need that space, and we want to incentivize you to maybe look toward federal space first. Trina,
Okay, Kelly. I'm sorry?
Oh, I just said, did you want to add anything to that?
No, that's okay. We have another question for you. Is the OA a lease?
So no, it's not a lease. And, also think about it that federal agencies cannot sue each other. So in that respect, the OA is not a legal document, but it is a valid agreement that both parties should be upheld to. An important distinction to make between a lease and an OA is that the lease is a legal document enforceable by law between GSA and the landlord, whereas the occupancy agreement, or OA, is the governing document between GSA and the tenant agency. So it really has to do with what two parties are involved. A lease is GSA and the lessor, the OA is GSA and the tenant agency.
Thank you, Kelly. We have another question. Can you give some examples of what makes a space non-marketable?
Okay, so I think I mentioned some in my presentation, so if I repeat myself, forgive me. Let's see, maybe if you had a loading dock or a mailroom in a single tenant building, that would be non-marketable because there's no one else that's going to take such a small space. If you had a space that is not accessible from the building's common corridor, if a tenant agency had a space and they had a conference room that was in the middle of the space, if they just wanted to return the conference room space, that would not be marketable. They could, however, if they wanted, at their own cost, construct a hallway from the common corridor to the conference room, which in turn would make it marketable, because then other people renting that space would be able to access it without having to go to the tenant agency space. So again, like if you had office suite that doesn't have exterior accessibility, Or also if you had multiple offices that were scattered throughout your space and you wanted to return all these multiple spaces, that would probably be unmarketable because they're not contiguous. So those are some examples.
Thank you, Kelly. I think we'll do one more question here and then probably close out. What is the process to release space?
Oh, that's a good one. That's okay. So, and I will include this in the PowerPoint. To release space, the customer agencies submit a notification to our mailbox. I think it's space.release@gsa.gov. The notification must be submitted at least 4 months prior to when the agency wants to release the space. However, the sooner the better. So even if you don't know the exact date, it's still beneficial to give us notice as soon as you can if there's any intention to release space. If the space request is sent directly to PBS personnel, like maybe someone just in your region, that 4-month window is not going to start until the PBS person forwards it to our email address. So it's really helps you in terms of making sure that 4 months starts when you want it if you send it directly to the space.release@gsa.gov. Some things that email would need to include are your OA number, your location, a description of the space, and your approximate requested release date. Again, we don't need an exact date, we just need an approximation. And then at that point, your regional contact will work with you to determine and verify that the space is still marketable. They have to verify the final square footage and also the release date. So it may happen that sometimes those estimated release dates have to be adjusted to accommodate the project date or your physical move schedule. Important to note though, a signed OA is not required to release the space. We will confirm the release of space once we receive the notification, and then we forward it to the appropriate regional person. And again, like I said, they will work with you on specific details to let you know whether their space is accepted or rejected and what you need to fix in order to make it acceptable. And once you physically vacate the space, your regional contact will confirm that, it's all clear, that all your personal property has been removed, and then we complete a condition survey report. So after that, your occupancy gets updated prior to your next billing cycle, and we send you a final email confirming that everything is complete and you are no longer being charged rent in that space. So that was a mouthful. And again, I can include that in the pricing notes.
Thank you, Kelly. And I think that pretty much concludes it. I just want to say, if I did not get to your question, we will answer all questions that were submitted in a set of FAQs that will come out after this presentation. Thank you.
So if we go to the last slide, I think client engagement has some information for you guys. I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to listen to our presentation. And I really do hope that you found it informative. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you, Kelly, for a great presentation. I think it was very thorough and answered a lot of questions or prompted further questioning, which is, exactly what we want to see out of these. I also want to thank all of you, our clients, who were able to join us. I hope that you enjoyed the presentation. We will post the formal written responses to the questions you posted in our Q&A panel as a frequently asked questions document for future reference on our website, www.gsa.gov/CES. You can learn more and sign up at that same link. The goal of the Client Enrichment Series is to engage our audience in workplace topics that contribute to your mission success and to your effective management of real estate and workplace programs. Our next presentation will be April 13th from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern, focusing on the future of federal work insights. And then we'll have another on e-read digest coming up in May. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out at any time. And thank you, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and week.